Yo, what's going on, everyone? It's Brian and Jim here with Drink a Beer and Play a Game, and today we are going to be reviewing RetroMania for the Xbox One.
Yep, and before we get started, we have to give a big shout out to Retrosoft Studios, who gave us review codes to take a look at this. So thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
All right, let's get into it. Released in February of 2021, this was developed and published by Retrosoft Studios. It came out on the PlayStation 4, the Nintendo Switch, the Xbox One, and Microsoft Windows. This game is a 100% complete love letter to indie wrestling, to classic wrestling games, and to like the YouTube community as a whole. So when it comes to retro gaming and retro wrestling and indie wrestling and everything thrown together, these guys definitely have that feel down. Does that lead to a good game, though? Well, let's get into it.
The graphics. Well, Jim already mentioned this is a love letter to not only the indie scene, but retro wrestling games in general. And of course, as soon as you look at this, your mind is going to go right to WWF WrestleFest. And I'll give them all the credit in the world. They mimic that style to a T. And they went above and beyond by giving every wrestler a ton of detail, even down to their names, and the fonts used are completely unique for each wrestler. On top of that, you have 17 different arenas, and I think it's an interesting situation where you have more arenas than you do wrestlers. Another great part of this game is these are the most unique arenas I've seen in a wrestling game, and I don't even know how long. Of course, a personal favorite of Jim and mine is the Too Many Games, because we were there. We actually saw some wrestling events. So they really do a lot of love for the community, and I actually get a lot of enjoyment at just looking at the crowd and seeing all the random characters they somehow mash in there.
Brian, there's so many YouTubers in the crowd.
There really are. I could only name two, Jim. I'm sure you could name a lot more.
Oh no, there's a butt ton that they snuck in there. Not us, though. We're not big.
One day, Jim.
One of these decades.
Once again, they nailed the style. There's plenty of good coloring. So for scores, I gave it a 7. Jim gave it an 8. I definitely recognize it's well above average. For me, though, I still think, okay, you didn't go that much further above what you were intending it to look like. So I couldn't give it too many more points. When it comes to beer, I'm just going to add 1 for the unique choice of doing more arenas than wrestlers.
So when it comes to the sound, this is a really good package. And my favorite part right off the bat has to be all the entrance themes. So they really went out of their way to, in my opinion, take their most known theme for each wrestler and give it their own little spin. I guess enough to, circumvent some copyright too. But you definitely get the feel of each wrestler from their theme songs. So that's such an awesome touch. There's some voice acting in the game, like with ring announcers and with commentary, and it's fine, if not a little bit generic, but, it's kind of has to be, so it is what it is, but it does a good enough job. Nick Aldis cuts promos when you go through the 10 pounds of gold mode, so that's always nice to see. I'm a fan of his work. But just in general, like, the sound effects they do the job perfectly well. Everything's what you would expect from a game from the era just put into today. And then all the added actual voice work is just icing on the cake. So even for guys like Austin Idol, who as far as I know didn't have any intro music because they're from an older era, it's cool that they threw some stuff his way too. So I just like this package all around, no true complaints, and we both gave it 8s. And when it comes to beer, I'll just add 1 beer for, I don't know, maybe Nick could have been a little more excited cutting those promos. I don't know, maybe he's not used to a booth.
The control. As soon as I turned this game on and I realized, I thought this was going to be a WrestleFest clone, I was like, this is going to be easy control. Yeah, it wasn't. Very quickly I realized this tries to mimic Fire Pro a little more, and I know Jim's going to get into it with the momentum system, but breaking down what you have available, you have a weak move, a strong move, and a medium move. Then you have Y as a run button, your D-pad moves your guy around, and the button you're going to use the most is taunt as RB. But then to do actions like entering the ropes or leaving the ring, you have to double tap the D-pad. What's very odd to me is everything in this game just feels a little bit more clunky than it needs to be. Because I thought it was going to be very simplistic, arcadey, and it is until you get into the depths of actually trying to pull off moves. Because at first, you can only do weak moves, then you build up your momentum, you can do medium, and eventually when you build up enough, it's strong. Even when you think you get your timing down, there's these situations where it's just, lucky win in the grapple. So it almost is like a coin toss when you walk towards a guy and you initiate the grapple. You kind of never really know if you can win. So the good old days of a whole bunch of reversals like we got when we were growing up with wrestling games, that's completely gone. Like, it's just a luck of the draw. And even when you think you're good enough to turn up the difficulty, holy shit, you're not. So for us, that just really leans to a control that is way more complicated than it needs to be for a game that is so arcadey and how it's presented. So when it comes to scores, we both gave it 6s. If you know what you're doing, it's serviceable, but honestly, you're going to have to sink a lot of time in before you're even semi-efficient with what you need to do. When it comes to beer, I'm going to add 2 because I think it still is just way too clunky for its own good.
All right, the gameplay. So Brian already touched on this, but this is a surprisingly deep game. So again, like him, I was expecting coming in and having goofy arcade action, and what I got was something that's way more complicated than it needs to be, but it also tries too hard. Let me explain. So here's how every match kind of went for the both of us. You start off with your light and normal attacks, knock them down, go run away, taunt, build your momentum, go back, rinse and repeat until you can start using your power moves. Then you kind of just spam power moves until you win. And you can fancy it up a bit. Like, if it really comes down to you get out of it what you put in the way that, like, sure, if you just want a straight up win, then you're going to do that. But if you want to mess around with the top rope moves and figuring out different combinations and corner moves and stuff like that, there's stuff to play around with here, but it's not really necessary. And if you get too fancy with it, it's almost going to be to your detriment, at least in our opinion. Because instead of just being straight arcadey, like Brian said, it throws in like momentum and the different strategies that you need from a Fire Pro, almost more simulation-y but clunkier. But then it also, with the reliance on taunting, it reminds me of the N64 era THQ games. And then with the grappling and the button mashing mechanics, it reminds me of like the LJN games like Raw and Royal Rumble. So you're adding all these different eras of wrestling games together and trying to force feed it almost into something that's going to be unique. And in the end, it just kind of misses the mark for us. There is fun to be had here, but unfortunately for us, it just all felt a little too clunky and complicated than it needed to be. Or at least what we were expecting going in. And even when it started to like hit and we finally understood how we're supposed to be playing it in order to win, it still just never kind of took off from a certain level. It kind of plateaus in its fun factor early. You do get a bunch of different game modes, so you get a story mode, which is pretty complex, and it has branching story paths whether you want to be a heel or a face, so that's pretty cool. My downer is you have to only play it as Johnny Nitro, and I mean, John Morrison's okay, but I wish you could have done it with some more characters. Then there's the 10...
Jim, you just want a blue meanie.
Did want blue meanie. And then there's the 10 pounds of gold mode, which you fight 6 matches to go against Nick Aldis to win the NWA Championship, and then you can fight another 6 matches to defend it, and that's the whole mode. You know, they have the Retro Rumble mode, and then you can have straight up exhibition matches, and you can play with buddies and stuff like that locally. So, unfortunately, there's no online component to this yet, and I get it because it's made by a small team and that's expensive. Unfortunately, in this day and age, it's something that would always just make that experience that much better, but it's not here. It is what it is. Maybe if the game sells more. You never know. So the roster's pretty eclectic because you get a lot of people from ECW, and now I guess you could call it House of Hardcore, NWA, AWA, even some WWF cast-offs. So I guess technically they could be considered AEW now too. And then MLW, and just people from all around the world in different time frames. And that's really cool to see. So, like we said before, this is definitely a love letter to the indies. Now, luckily for me, I know a lot of these people, but even people like Jeff Cobb, I was like, who? Unfortunately for Brian, unless they've ever shown up in WWF, he has no idea who they are. And even then, the Matt Cardanas and the whatever Kurt Hawkins' real name of the world is, you know, that's going to do nothing for him. So, Yeah, you have to really be in that scene to appreciate the wrestlers that are actually in the game. But if you're in that scene, it's really cool to see these guys in an actual game. So kudos to this game for that. So at the end of the day, when it comes down to just being a game that you sit down and play, we couldn't give it more than 5s. It's meant for a very specific audience, and I don't see the mass. It's not a game that's going to have mass appeal for the gameplay alone, or I guess for the roster that it's going for. But I understand where they're coming from, but it just missed a mark. But as a game itself, it's fine. And when it comes to beer, I'm going to add 2 beers. 1 for the very niche roster, and 2 for all the different modes that they just threw together. Just barely didn't reach what it could have been.
The originality. Jim and I, whenever we review games like this, it's always tough because you know they are trying to emulate previous styles, and we've already went over all the games where they've took little pieces here and there, and honestly, that's what this is. It's an amalgamation of, WrestleFest, Fire Pro, the N64 wrestling games, just all thrown together one way or another. The only pieces that really did feel original, as Jim hit on, it's that roster, who you're never going to see in most games, and the arenas of more unique places. It feels like a complete... If somebody were to create a game with all their favorite creative characters, this is what it feels like. So, when it comes to score, honestly, we could only give it 2s. Sometimes not being the most original is fine, and like we said, this game is all about offering people that indie experience. And when it comes to beer, I'm not even going to add any. It's not like the team developing this is making a claim like they're giving you the most original wrestling experience, because they're not. So you know what it is on the surface as soon as you start playing.
So when it comes to replayability, we've already touched on basically everything. So you have all the different game modes, you have a decent sized roster that they do plan on adding more characters to, you have local multiplayer, and the biggest miss that it is there's no online component to it. And also, if you could have played the story mode with a few more characters than just Johnny Retro, that would have been a nice touch as well. But there's still a lot to do in here, and of course there's achievements, so you'll have to spend a lot of time to 100% all those if you're that type. So when it comes down to points, Brian gave it a 6 and I gave it a 7. And when it comes to beer, it's just going to be one sad beer for no online component.
So overall, like Jim and I said, this game is so niche that if you love the indie wrestling scene, then this may be like a wet dream for you. What we will say is we love the presentation. The graphics, the sound, they're amazing. We just kind of wish they stuck with that presentation in the controls and gameplay and gave you more of an arcadey feel with maybe a little bit more options when it comes to like story mode and just general gameplay.
Yeah, so I love all the background around this game. I love how good they've been with the YouTube community in general. We saw their booth at Too Many Games a couple years back. There's the love to all the community around it that's been supporting it. There's definite love for the indie scene and all the wrestlers, like Brian said, who, unless you're into it, they would never get this kind of love in a video game. I love the creativity of all the different arenas and stuff like that. And again, with the House of Hardcore arena and the Japanese arenas and stuff like that. There's a love for the whole world of professional wrestling here. And like Brian says, I just wish the game was a little more pick up and play kind of fun. It just tries too hard to mash too many things together, and I know I've already said this, and it just misses the mark on balancing everything out, basically. It can be fun, and especially if you're a fanatic for these wrestlers, then you'll put a lot more fun into it than guys like us, but I really can't see a casual market really glomming onto this game for the gameplay alone, and it's unfortunate, but it is what it is, but it is a definite love letter, and as a love letter, it nails it, so... Yeah. It's a game I do want to see succeed. I just wish it was a little more fluid.
Yeah, when it comes to scores, we both gave it 6s. We've recognized all those pieces, and we know a lot of people, if this is a game you're searching for, you're going to score it much higher, and that's fine. Jim and I, he's a little more into it. I am more the casual, so it just didn't grab me the same way. When we combined all of our scores together, it comes out to a 5.9. So that's pretty much right on target with how we feel. I think what will really help elevate this game in the future is if the developers, they do add that online and maybe somehow figure out how to add in a few more wrestlers down the line. But either way, even if they don't add that, it's completely fine, especially if you love the indie scene.
Yeah, and I think it's a good building block. Like, it's something I hope that they can build from with this. I hope it's successful enough so they can maybe release another game that might be a little more streamlined and, that would attach more to a more casual audience, too. You never know.
Yeah. But either way, we do want to say once again, we thank them so much for sending us a copy of this. It means the world. We have all their links below.
Don't forget our No IPA May, which is probably going to be done by the time this video goes up, so someone will be getting an Xbox code for this, too.
That's right. Yeah. So, with that, everyone, we hope you guys have a good night, and cheers.
Cheers, guys.
When it comes to beer pairing, I decide to go with the Luchador and Fuego from Clown Shoes. This is an Imperial Stout coming in at 11.9% and is brewed with chipotle peppers. Just like this game, this is a very niche beer that only if you really enjoy some spice, high alcohol content, will you enjoy it. It's a delicious beer, but you gotta be into it. So grab a bottle or two and sit down and live out your favorite indie wrestling game. But remember to drink your beers and play your games responsibly.